you ever stood beneath the stars and felt the quiet ache of something missing, not from the world, but from within yourself? Have you ever stared into the stillness of night and sensed that behind all the noise, the striving, the endless doing, there's something else waiting, something soft, something steady, something true? You are not alone. Beneath our successes and failures, beneath the rushing hours and the quiet moments of doubt, there is a part of us that remembers. It doesn't remember facts or dates or names. It remembers a way of being, still, present, whole. That part of you is listening right now and tonight. I invite you to listen too, not with your ears alone, but with your breath, with your bones, with the space behind your thoughts. Because tonight isn't just about falling asleep. It's about falling inward. You're not here to learn in the way school taught you. You're here to unlearn the tension, the pressure, the expectation, to dissolve into stories that were never meant to impress you, but to undress the armor you didn't know you'd been wearing. These are Zen stories. Simple, strange, sometimes even a little absurd. But within their quiet humor and mystery, there's a kind of medicine, not the kind you swallow, but the kind you feel, like a cool wind on tired skin, like light slipping through the cracks, a monk crossing an ocean with nothing but a brush and a bowl, an old woman daring to question the Buddha, a drop of water reflecting the moon, a broom sweeping truth into the heart of bamboo. These aren't just tales from another time. They are doorways into a silence that knows your name. So, tonight, let go. Let the stories do their quiet work. You don't need to figure them out. You don't need to chase insight. You just need to rest, to return, to remember. This is not a performance. There are no stages here, no masks. Just you, and the part of you that was never lost, only quiet. And now, as your breath softens and your thoughts slow, let's begin our journey inward, not with answers, but with questions, not with control, but with curiosity. Let's begin and see what arises when we stop trying to become and simply begin to be. The ocean stretched endlessly blue, meeting blue, sky touching sea in a silence deeper than words. It was 1893, and the great ship moved steadily across the Pacific, her engines humming a rhythm that seemed almost meditative, like the soft pulse of breath in a sleeping body. At the edge of the deck, near the rail, stood a man whose presence did not announce itself loudly. He was not dressed in royal finery, nor did he bear any mark of title or wealth. But if you had walked past him, you would have stopped, not because he called you, but because something inside you would have recognized something quiet, powerful, and ancient. His name was Soyen Shaku, a Zen monk traveling far beyond the boundaries of his homeland. And though the ship carried many passengers, it was this small, robed figure who bore the weight of something greater than luggage or letters, the transmission of a way of seeing, a way of being that would soon begin to take root in the soul of the Western world. The wind tugged gently at his robes, as if trying to read the lines of history hidden in their folds. He stood still, eyes on the horizon, not searching, not calculating, but watching in the way that only someone deeply practiced in silence can watch. His hands held a small leather-bound journal, worn at the edges from use, its paper marked by the careful brushstrokes of a mind that did not rush. He wasn't writing for others. He wasn't crafting a speech or a manifesto. He was, as always, returning to the core of practice, to the rhythm beneath language, to the place within where truth does not shout, but breathes. Beside him stood a young man, barely in his 20s, though his posture carried a gravity unusual for someone so young. His name was Suzuki, later to be known to the world as D.T. Suzuki, the scholar who would one day translate Zen not just into English, but into experience for countless Western seekers. But now, he was simply a student, and like all true students, he asked not from arrogance, but from wonder. "Master," he said softly, bowing. "Many of the people we will meet in America admire the philosophy of Zen, but they do not understand how to live it. May I ask, what are you writing?" Soyen Shaku did not answer immediately. He closed the journal gently and turned toward the sea. The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture, like the surface of deep water still, but alive. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, low, and steady, like the quiet part of a mountain stream. "I am writing," he said. "The principles I return to each day. Not philosophy, not theory, just living." There was nothing dramatic in his tone, no effort to impress, and yet, those words struck deeper than any argument ever could. In a world where people seek complexity, his simplicity rang like a bell in fog. It is easy to talk about Zen, harder to live it, harder still to live it, without needing others to know that you are. And that is what Soyen Shaku had mastered, the art of living deeply without decoration. He handed the journal to his student. Suzuki opened it carefully, as one would open an old letter from a loved one long gone. The pages carried handwritten characters, elegant, patient, each stroke a meditation in itself, but more than ink. They carried presence, the kind of presence that makes even simple words feel weighty. Suzuki read, "In the morning, before dressing, light incense and meditate." He paused. Such a small instruction, and yet, in it, a revolution. To begin the day not with doing, but with being. To attend to stillness before putting on any external identity, before the clothes, before the roles, before the world asks who you are, returning to who you already are. The next line: retire at a regular hour, eat with moderation, never to the point of satisfaction. Again, so simple. But isn't that what true discipline looks like? Not flashy, not extreme, but steady, unshaken. The kind of rhythm that makes inner freedom possible, because the body is not dragged by whims and cravings. Suzuki continued reading, and with each line, he felt something shift, not in the world outside, but in the alignment of his own being. Each principle, a mirror, not telling you what to do, but showing you where you've been distracted. And yet, they weren't commandments. They weren't shoulds. They were invitations, gently whispered, like a friend tapping your shoulder and saying, "Hey, remember." That was the essence of Soyen Shaku's teaching. Not to impose Zen, but to embody it. Not to convert, but to remember. The ship rocked gently beneath their feet. Somewhere above, Seabirds circled, somewhere below. Propellers churned against an invisible current. But on the deck, something very old was being passed, not in ceremony, not in fire and thunder, but in silence and paper and breath. Suzuki closed the journal. He looked at his teacher, and for the first time, he truly saw not just the man, but the space around the man, the absence of resistance, the soft gravity of presence. These principles, he said, are so ordinary, yet they feel like they contain everything. And Soyen Shaku smiled. Simple, he said. Yes. Easy. No. He turned again to the sea and said, more to himself than to anyone else, my heart burns like fire, but my eyes are as cold as dead ashes. Suzuki stood silently, feeling the weight of that sentence settle into his bones. Burning heart, cold eyes. How could one hold both? And yet, there it was. The fire of devotion, of urgency, of love, the ashes of detachment, of clarity, of peace, not one or the other, both, balanced, whole. This was the Zen that Soyen Shaku carried not in books, not in lectures, but in how he stood, how he breathed, how he greeted the horizon each morning as if it had something new to say. And soon, he would step onto a foreign land, among foreign minds, and he would not preach. He would simply live, and that would be enough. That, in itself, would become the beginning of a quiet revolution. Imagine waking up each morning, not to alarms or demands, not to deadlines or notifications, but to the soft scent of incense, curling like breath through the stillness of a quiet room. No urgency, no rush, only the deliberate choice to begin the day from within before touching anything without. This was the first of many simple, yet profound, principles that guided the daily life of Zen Master Soyen Shaku. Before dressing, before even putting on the garments that marked his identity, he would light incense and sit to the outside world. This might seem like a ritual, but it was not habit. It was intention. It was a reminder that presence must come before performance, stillness before movement, being before doing. In that small act, he reordered the entire structure of a day. Because when we begin from silence, the noise of the world no longer controls us. We do not chase life. We meet it. What would shift in your life if, just for one morning, you paused before everything else and simply sat with your breath? No goals, no productivity, just presence. That was the first thread in Soyen Shaku's quiet tapestry of daily principles. The second, eat with moderation, never to the point of satisfaction. This one catches most people by surprise. Because in a world where fullness is celebrated, where satisfaction is marketed like a product, the idea of stopping before satisfaction sounds almost foolish. But here, Zen offers a different logic. When we stop before fullness, we leave space, not just in the belly, but in the heart, in the mind, space for awareness, space for gratitude, space to remember that we are not meant to be filled to the brim, but to remain porous, permeable to life. Have you ever noticed how fullness makes us sleepy? How abundance can dull our senses? Soyen Shaku ate just enough to be nourished, never enough to be numbed. And in that discipline, he found clarity, because hunger, just a hint of it, sharpens perception. Not the painful hunger of deprivation, but the gentle edge of alertness that comes from living with intention. His meals were not performances. There was no indulgence, no rush. Each bite, a meditation. Each moment of chewing, a communion with life itself. It's not that food was unimportant. It's that it was sacred, not because it was fancy, but because it was enough. Another of his principles, retire at a regular hour. To modern ears, this might sound like advice from a grandmother, but in the rhythm of Zen, sleep is not just rest, it is release. To go to bed at the same hour each night is to affirm trust in the cycle of life, to let go at the right time, to stop grasping, to stop doing, to say. With the turning of the earth now is the time for surrender. We often pride ourselves on staying up late, pushing limits, being productive, but Soyen Shaku saw it differently. To fight the rhythm of nature is to scatter the mind. To honor it is to return. There was no victory in staying up longer, only disconnection. But in sleeping at the right time, the body becomes an ally. The mind becomes calm. Dreams become clear. Another of his teachings, receive a guest with the same presence you have when alone. And when alone, maintain the same presence as if receiving a guest. This is not just social advice, it is spiritual instruction. Most people wear different faces for different roles, one for family, one for strangers, one for lovers, one for solitude. But Zen doesn't divide the self. In every moment alone or accompanied, Soyen Shaku called for authenticity, not performance, not pretense, but a consistent awareness that does not depend on who is watching. It's easy to be kind when others are looking, harder when we are alone with our thoughts. But Zen asks, can you bring that same grace, that same dignity? To your own mind, can you sit in silence with yourself as if you were your own honored guest? Can you host your own breath like a friend? This was how he lived. Another teaching. Watch what you say, and whatever you say, live it. This principle cuts deep, because most of us speak from convenience, not from conviction. We make promises we don't keep. We say things to be liked or to be clever, but words, in Zen, are sacred instruments, not decorations, declarations. Each word a vow, each phrase a mirror. For Soyen Shaku, speech was not just expression, it was alignment. To say something was to place a weight on the scale of being, and once spoken, it had to be carried. So he spoke carefully, softly, but with the kind of integrity that made even a whisper feel like a drumbeat. He did not separate words from deeds. He braided them, and in that braiding, he walked in harmony. Another of his daily codes, when opportunity comes, do not let it pass, yet always think twice before acting. This sounds like a contradiction. Act but pause. Move but reflect. But it is the perfect dance of Zen. Zen is not paralysis. It is not waiting endlessly, but neither is it impulse. It is the balance of presence and discernment. To see clearly when a door opens, and yet not rush through without awareness. Soyen Shaku believed that opportunities are sacred, but not every open door leads where you want to go. So he taught his students, step, but know where your foot is landing. Pause, but do not sleepwalk. Be ready, but be rooted. Another of his rules, do not regret the past. Look to the future. Such a small sentence, but behind it, centuries of practice. Regret, in Zen, is like trying to carry water in a closed fist. It spills, it slips, and it distracts. The past cannot be held, but it can be honored and then released. The future cannot be predicted, but it can be prepared for. So we look forward, not to control, but to walk in trust. Another line from his journal: have the fearless attitude of a hero and the loving heart of a child. This one is perhaps the most beautiful. It is the integration of opposites. Most people choose one. They are brave, but cold, or kind, but afraid. But Zen says, why not both? Why not walk through fire? With a smile. Why not stand your ground? While opening your arms, Soyen Shaku believed that courage without compassion was hollow, and love without strength was fragile. So he carried both, and it made him a force not of domination, but of liberation. Finally, the last of the daily principles upon retiring: sleep as if this were your last sleep. Upon awakening, rise as if throwing away old shoes. This is where it all comes together. Each day is a life, each night a death, each morning a rebirth. To sleep with the completeness of final surrender, to wake with the freshness of beginning again. No residue, no dragging the past forward. Just now, just breath, just presence. These were not abstract rules. They were breath and bone. They were ink on a page that became rhythm in a life. Soyen Shaku lived what he wrote, and in doing so, left behind not a doctrine, but a doorway. And now, that doorway stands open for you. The sea air was cool that morning, brushing gently across the deck like the breath of something ancient, whispering secrets into the folds of silence. The steamship continued its journey toward the Western world, steady and unwavering, while the sky overhead remained a vast, pale blue, empty, yet full of possibility. Suzuki stood near the ship's railing, the journal of his master still in his hands. He had read the words before he had even heard them spoken aloud during lessons in the monastery. But somehow, here, now, with the sea beneath and the west ahead, those same words pulsed differently. They no longer sat in his mind as ideas. They moved. He turned toward his teacher, who stood not far, gazing at the horizon with a kind of presence Suzuki had never fully understood until now. Soyen Shaku was not performing Zen. He was Zen, and this realization, though quiet, rang like a bell in the young student's chest. "Master," Suzuki said softly, approaching with measured steps, "your principles, they're so ordinary, so plain, yet somehow they feel like they contain everything." Soyen Shaku did not turn immediately. He simply stood in silence, allowing the moment to stretch, to deepen. Then, with a calm breath, he replied, "The most profound truths are always simple." He turned to face his student, his eyes clear, still. Ancient met Suzuki's, not with authority, but with intimacy. It is their application. He continued, "That transforms them." That sentence sank like a stone into Suzuki's awareness. It wasn't about understanding. It was about embodiment. He had spent years studying sutras, memorizing teachings, contemplating paradoxes, and koans. His shelves were full of scripture, his mind a labyrinth of Zen philosophy. But here was his teacher carrying no scrolls, quoting no texts, just living, just breathing, just waking early, sitting before dawn, eating humbly, bowing when spoken to, walking with the same grace whether the deck was full of scholars or empty under moonlight. There was nothing to prove, and because of that, everything was present. Master, Suzuki asked again, more hesitantly this time. But what about the Americans? Many of them are intellectuals, thinkers. They'll want definitions, doctrine, debate. Soyen Shaku's lips curved, almost imperceptibly, into a smile. If they want debate, he said. There are universities. He turned back toward the sea, the wind lifting the edge of his robe like a sigh. But if they want peace, they will have to learn to sit with tea. Suzuki paused, unsure how to respond. The simplicity of that statement disarmed him. There was no argument to be made, no counterpoint, just the image humble and whole of tea shared in silence. Then, he asked the question that had been waiting in the back of his mind since they boarded the ship. Master, do you ever doubt this time? Soyen Shaku looked directly at him. There was no surprise in his face, only presence. Every morning, he said. Suzuki's eyes widened. But you seem so calm, so certain. His teacher nodded gently. Certainty, he said, is not the absence of doubt. It is the intimacy with it. That answer struck Suzuki more deeply than any philosophical teaching he had ever received, because for years, he had tried to eliminate doubt, to meditate it away, to replace it with knowledge, control, mastery. But here was his master admitting to doubt, but not fighting it, just bowing to it, making space for it. And somehow, in that space, certainty arose not as dogma, but as presence. They stood together for a while in silence, the waves moving beneath them like breath, steady and endless. Finally, Suzuki broke the quiet. Master, when I return to Japan one day, and students ask me what I learned in the West, what should I tell them? Soyen Shaku reached for the journal Suzuki still held. He turned to a blank page, and with careful strokes, he wrote a single character. Shin Shin, he said. Heart-mind. Suzuki studied the character. It was one he had seen 1,000 times, but here, written alone on the page, in the middle of the ocean, by the hand of someone who lived each stroke it felt new. What does it mean, he whispered. It means everything, said Soyen Shaku. And nothing. Suzuki smiled faintly, recognizing the koan hidden in plain sight. But this time, he didn't try to solve it. He just breathed. The teacher turned, walking slowly along the deck, his steps as soft as prayer, and the student stood, holding the journal close, not as an object of study, but as a living thread, a reminder that Zen was not something to understand, but to be, to breathe, to walk, to offer. The sea stretched on. The west drew closer, but in that moment, Suzuki realized he had already arrived. The words came not like thunder, but like embers, soft, glowing, quiet, and yet unforgettable. My heart burns like fire, but my eyes are as cold as dead ashes. Suzuki had heard many teachings from his master. He had read volumes of sutras, listened to countless talks, meditated through long nights in still halls. But this single line, spoken almost as an afterthought, reverberated through him in a way nothing else had. There was something about it, a contradiction, a paradox, or perhaps a adore? What did it mean to live with a burning heart and eyes as cold as dead ashes in the days that followed? Suzuki carried that line with him like a koan, repeating it silently as he moved about the ship. He watched the sun rise over the ocean, fire spreading across the sky, while the water beneath remained impossibly still. He saw the cook's hands move quickly in the galley, tending the boiling pots with urgent care, yet his face remained placid, unchanged by the heat. He began to see it everywhere. That balance, that strange harmony, the fusion of opposites that didn't cancel each other out, but made each other possible. And slowly, Suzuki began to understand. A heart that burns is a heart alive. It's the fire of devotion, of purpose, of compassion that doesn't rest. It's the fire that drives a monk across an ocean, that wakes one before dawn to sit in silence, that bows to strangers with no expectation. It is not ambition. It is not aggression. It is not noise. It is intensity without drama, commitment without craving. It's the quiet flame of someone who has decided, truly decided to live fully, to feel deeply, to love and hurt and serve without needing to be seen doing so. But fire alone is dangerous. A heart that burns, unchecked, consumes itself. It blinds. It devours. This is where the eyes come in. Eyes like dead ashes. What does that mean? It means clarity. It means detachment, not from life, but from reactivity. It means seeing things as they are, without distortion, no heat, no smoke, no stories, just awareness, pure, clean, silent, to burn with the heart, but see with the eyes of emptiness. This was the Zen way. Most people choose one. Some live in fire passion, emotion, intensity, but they're consumed by their own reactions. They burn hot and fast, then fall. Others retreat into coldness, control, calculation, withdrawal, and they feel nothing. No connection, no warmth, no grief. But Zen is not about choosing. It's about holding both. Like the ocean under fire-colored skies. Like the incense smoke that curls up while the candle flame remains still. Soyen Shaku did not preach balance. He embodied it. Suzuki remembered watching him one morning, sitting on the deck as the sun rose. The wind pulled at his sleeves. A gull cried above. A child nearby had dropped a plate, and it shattered noisily near his feet. And yet, he did not flinch, not because he didn't care, but because he was there completely, unshaken, burning inside, watching outside, present all the way through. This, Suzuki realized, was the path he had not yet touched. He had studied the teachings, he had absorbed the words, but his heart was still half hidden, his eyes still clouded. He had wanted understanding without fire, clarity without surrender. Now, he saw why it had eluded him. To truly live Zen, one must risk burning. One must offer the heart, but not as a sacrifice, as an offering. And one must learn to see not through hope, or fear, or longing, but through the stillness that remains when everything else dissolves. This is what his master meant. My heart burns like fire, but my eyes are as cold as dead ashes. It is a way of living, a way of leading, a way of loving. And it is not easy, because most of us are trained to either cling or withdraw, to react or repress, but to do neither, to feel everything, to act with urgency and observe with stillness requires a different kind of strength. It requires wholeness. It requires silence inside the flame. And it begins, not in the heat of crisis, but in the choices no one sees. Waking early, eating simply, walking slowly, speaking truthfully. It begins in stillness, in knowing when to move and when to wait, when to stand, and when to sit in the ashes, quiet and clear. Suzuki thought of the world they were sailing toward full of speed, intellect, ambition. He wondered how these teachings would land there. Would people understand this paradox? Would they want to? He wasn't sure. But one thing he did know. He had seen it lived, and once seen. It could not be unseen. His master didn't just teach Zen. He was Zen, and his fire, and his ashes, would soon touch a world that had forgotten both. In a world where days begin with digital alarms and end with exhausted scrolling, where meals are eaten over keyboards and conversations compete with screens, where busy is a badge of honor, and silence feels almost suspicious, it can be hard to imagine a life shaped by stillness. But that's precisely what Master Soyen Shaku offered, not through theories, not through dogma, but through the quiet precision of daily living. His principles, so simple they might seem naive, carry within them a radical rebellion against the speed, the noise, and the fragmentation of modern life. And perhaps, more than ever, we are ready for them. Let us begin again with the morning before dressing. Light incense and meditate. This isn't about incense, it's about intention in modern life. We are taught to begin by reaching outward toward calendars, emails, updates, alerts. But Soyen Shaku turned inward first. He reminded us, the way you begin your day is not trivial. It is a tone, a tuning. 5 minutes of presence can rewire the entire nervous system. You may not have a monastery, but you have a moment. You have breath. You can sit on the edge of your bed and feel your feet on the floor. You can place your hand on your chest and feel it rise. You can start not with consumption, but connection. And in that simple act, before the coffee, before the clothes, you tell the day, I am here, not to chase, but to meet. Retire at a regular hour. We resist this one. Modern life tells us that productivity never sleeps, that rest is weakness, that staying up later means staying ahead. But Zen whispers a different truth. Your body is not an enemy. It is a temple. Rhythm is not restriction. It is harmony. To sleep at the right time is not laziness. It is trust. Trust that the world will turn without you, that your worth is not measured by how long you stay awake. Soyen Shaku did not need a clock. He followed the deeper time, the sun, the breath, the body's wisdom. And what if we did too? Even just one night a week. Lights off, screens away, breath slow. Not because it's efficient, but because it's enough. Eat with moderation. Never to the point of satisfaction. In a culture of excess, this feels like heresy. We are told to indulge, to reward ourselves, to eat not to nourish, but to numb. But in Zen, eating is not escape. It is presence. To eat with moderation is not about denial. It is about tuning your senses back to subtlety. The way a spoon feels in the hand, the sound of chewing. The moment hunger gives way, not to fullness, but to enough. There is peace in that space. Not the dull peace of being stuffed, but the alert peace of clarity. Soyen Shaku wasn't counting calories. He was cultivating awareness. And in a world obsessed with food rules and guilt, his simple principle says, just listen. Your body knows. Receive a guest with the same heart you have when alone. When alone, maintain the same heart you would with a guest. In a digital world full of personas, this is revolutionary. We wear masks, one for colleagues, one for friends, one for family, and often, none for ourselves. But Zen does not separate public and private. It asks, can you be one? The same presence you offer a guest warm, attentive, curious, can you offer that to your own breath, to the silence in a room? And when you're with others, can you stay rooted, not perform? In practice, this might look like turning off your phone when someone speaks, looking into their eyes, not through them, or simply breathing when alone, not as preparation for people, but as your natural state. Soyen Shaku reminded us that integrity isn't just ethics, it's wholeness. And in a fragmented world, wholeness is a healing act. Watch what you say, and whatever you say, live it. In the age of quick opinions and faster contradictions, this lands like a bell in fog. Words, in Zen, are not decoration. They are commitment. To speak is to plant, and you must be willing to harvest what you sow. Soyen Shaku didn't speak much, but when he did, every word had weight, because he lived them first. In our time, we say much, but what if we slowed down? What if we asked, before speaking, is it true? Is it necessary? Am I ready to live it? This is not about perfection. It is about alignment. When speech and action match, we become whole again, and others feel it, even if they can't explain why. When opportunity comes, do not let it pass, yet always think twice before acting. At first glance, this seems contradictory, but in truth, it is balance. Modern life tells us act fast, grab it, but Zen says yes. And look, opportunity is sacred, but so is discernment. This principle is about stillness in motion. The ability to see clearly in a world that blurs speed with wisdom. In practice, this could mean saying yes to a new path, but taking a breath before you step. It's not hesitation, it's awareness. Soyen Shaku moved slowly, but never aimlessly. He was deliberate. And when he acted, the movement was clean. No regret, no second guessing. This is a kind of freedom we rarely taste. Do not regret the past. Look to the future. Regret is like carrying a heavy bag of broken glass. You bleed, but never repair. Soyen Shaku did not deny mistakes. He just didn't live in them. The past is the ink already dry. The present, the pen still moving. To look ahead is not to forget. It is to forgive yourself. And when we stop dragging the weight of yesterday, we become light, not irresponsible, just free. And from that freedom, the next step becomes clear. Have the fearless attitude of a hero and the loving heart of a child. This is the crown of his teachings. Fearlessness does not mean recklessness. It means being rooted in something deeper than fear. And love does not mean softness. It means openness. To live with both is rare, but Soyen Shaku did, and so can we. To stand in a storm, with eyes open and arms still willing to embrace. To walk into the unknown, with the curiosity of a child, not despite your wounds, but because of them. This is the Zen way, and it is possible here, now. You don't need a robe or a temple. You need a moment. This one. The morning light touched the village like a whispered blessing. Not loud, not dazzling, just enough to brush the rooftops, enough to remind everything that the day had begun. It was a quiet village. Modest homes, woven baskets stacked near doorways, the smell of boiled rice drifting from open windows. Children's laughter danced through the alleys like birdsong, and old men, wrapped in simple shawls, warmed their hands around clay cups of tea. The people of this village lived with the land. They did not speak in theories. They knew the shape of monsoon clouds, the way mangoes ripened in July, and the silence of a well at dusk. But on this day, a different kind of stillness filled the air, because word had come the Buddha would pass through. Not just a rumor this time. A message from the neighboring hamlet confirmed it. He was on his way, walking slowly as he always did, with his disciples a few steps behind. No horses, no banners, just feet on soil, robes faded by time, and eyes that had seen through the illusions of the world. Villagers began their preparations in hushed excitement. They swept the common path. Children were told to be still, to listen. Some carried garlands of jasmine. Some lit incense before small household shrines. The banyan tree at the edge of the village, the place where he had once sat many years ago, was swept clean. And yet, on the other side of the village, far from the gathering, stood a woman. Her name was Amala. She had not gathered flowers. She had not cleaned her threshold. She stood instead with arms crossed, eyes steady, mouth thin with memory. Amala was not like the others. Her presence carried a certain gravity. She was neither revered nor ignored. People greeted her respectfully, but always with a slight distance, as if unsure how close they were allowed to be. She had no children, no husband, no shrine in her home. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was sharp, clean like a blade, with no ornament. In her youth, it was said, she'd been full of laughter. Stories surrounded her name, how she sang under moonlight, how her cooking once drew travelers from 2 villages away. But something had happened, and no one knew what. Some whispered it was a broken engagement. Others believed she had lost a child. Some said her brother had gone to war and never returned. She never confirmed, never denied. She simply grew silent, and in that silence, something hardened. She no longer sang, no longer welcomed guests. Only once in a while, when the Buddha's name came up in conversation, her voice would return low, clipped, and bitter. Peace, she would say, is for those who've never bled. His silence may comfort you, but it has never fed me. He left a wife, a child. Do you call that enlightenment? And so, when the news spread of his arrival, the village buzzed with quiet devotion. Except for Amala, she did not prepare garlands. She prepared herself, not to listen, but to speak, not with reverence, but with fire, because beneath her bitterness lay something even older, disappointment, and beneath that, something deeper, still grief. She had once believed. She had once sat at the foot of the banyan tree as a young woman and listened as the Buddha spoke. He did not preach. He simply told of suffering, of cause and release, of breath and stillness, and something in her soft and young and yearning had opened. But life had not been gentle since then, and somewhere along the way, she decided that silence had not protected her, stillness had not saved her, and so she abandoned it and turned her ache into armor. But now, the man she had once trusted was returning, and with him came everything she had buried. She stood by the edge of the path, not hidden, not waiting to bow, but standing upright like a question. The sun had just risen above the palms. The dust from the morning wind still hovered like breath over the road, and the villagers began to gather. Some sat cross-legged. Some brought fruit, small offerings. Some simply brought their children, hoping they would remember this day. But Amala brought none of that. She brought only her voice, and a storm she'd carried for decades. Dust rose slowly as their feet touched the path. The Buddha walked in silence, each step an act of presence. His robes, plain and weathered, swayed gently with his movement. Around him, disciples followed, some young, some gray-haired, none speaking. There was no announcement, no demand for attention, just stillness entering noise. Children ran ahead, pointing. Mothers called their names. Farmers paused mid-swing, their tools held above the soil like offerings, and the crowd began to part, not out of fear, but of reverence. All except one. Amala stood at the far end of the road, unmoving, her eyes fixed on him, her breath sharp, steady. The moment had arrived, and with it, everything she had never said. As the Buddha came near, she did not bow. She stepped forward. Her voice cracked the air like dry wood snapping. "You," she said. He stopped, not startled, not guarded, just still. Amala's eyes narrowed. Her face was a map of timelines, carved by weather, and weeping, and waking before dawn alone. "You," she said again, louder now. "You come here as if the earth is yours to walk, as if your silence is wisdom, as if your peace is truth." The crowd froze. Children clutched their mothers. Some whispered, unsure whether to intervene, unsure whether this was blasphemy or bravery, but the Buddha remained unmoved. He met her eyes, softly, without defense, and somehow that enraged her more. She stepped closer. "Do you remember me?" she asked. No answer. "Of course you don't. You remember no one. You left your family like dry leaves in the wind. You speak of detachment as if love is a sickness. You sit while others break. You breathe while others bleed." Her hands were trembling now, not with fear, but with history. "You came here once before. I sat beneath that tree," she pointed, "and I listened. I was young. I believed you. I believed that stillness would save me, that surrender would heal me." Her voice cracked. I waited. I meditated. I bowed. And then life came, and it tore everything. She paused. Her chest rose, fell. "I buried my son alone. I buried my joy, and your silence. It did not speak to me." The Buddha said nothing, not because he had no words, but because he chose space. And in that space, something unexpected happened. Amala's fury faltered, not extinguished, but questioned. "Say something," she hissed. "Defend yourself. Justify this path you sell like balm." Still, he remained. His gaze was not pity. It was not superiority. It was not avoidance. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, She began to see her own reflection not as an enemy, but as a flame burning for years without air, without rest. Finally, he spoke. His voice was not loud. It did not echo. It arrived like water finds stone gently, thoroughly. I remember you. The words were not meant to flatter. They carried no performance. I remember your breath. He continued, the way you listened, not with your ears, but with your longing. Amala's lips parted. You were not weak, he said. You were open. She stepped back, uncertain. You say I left, he said softly, but I left only what could not be carried. He looked beyond her now, as if seeing something no one else could. I did not abandon love. I learned not to cling to its shadow. The crowd was silent. Even the wind had stilled. Amala's eyes filled not with tears yet, but with heat. Not anger this time, but ache. You teach of suffering, she said, her voice low now. But you cannot know mine. He nodded once. You are right. The honesty shook her more than any denial would have. I do not know your pain. I know only pain itself. It changes its face, but not its root. And then, a silence, deeper than words. No defense, no sermon, just presence. And in that presence, Amala broke, not loudly, not with sobs, but like a rock giving way to river. Her shoulders fell. Her arms, once crossed, slowly opened. And from that space, her voice returned, not sharp, not bitter, just small. I'm tired, she whispered. The Buddha stepped forward, not closer in distance, but in stillness. You have carried a mountain, he said, but you were meant to carry water. Amala closed her eyes, and for the first time in decades, she exhaled. The dust had barely settled from her words, but something inside her had already begun to shift. Amala stood before the Buddha, not in victory, not in defeat, but in an unfamiliar stillness, as though something old inside her had grown suddenly quiet. The rage that had roared for years now flickered like a candle in the wind. The accusations she'd carried like armor now hung loosely around her. Too heavy to wear, and yet too familiar to drop. And yet, he said nothing. He didn't flinch under her voice, didn't interrupt her sorrow, didn't offer solutions or sermons. He simply stood barefoot on the earth, eyes soft as dusk, breathing slowly, the way only those with nothing to prove can breathe. This silence unnerved her more than anything else, not because it was empty, but because it was full. Full of presence, full of space, full of a kind of knowing that didn't demand words to be real. She shifted her stance, arms still folded, but the tightness in her chest had begun to loosen without permission. You just stand there, she muttered. Don't you have anything to say after everything? Her voice no longer sharp, just exposed. The Buddha looked into her, not at her, not through her, but into her, and with a voice as calm as falling leaves, he spoke. I hear you. 3 words. No philosophy, no defense, just recognition. Amala didn't know how to answer. She hadn't come to be heard. She had come to resist, to reject, maybe even to destroy. But what do you destroy when nothing resists you? How do you fight someone who sees you without judgment? The crowd around them stayed quiet, unsure whether they were witnessing confrontation or healing. I have carried this anger for so long, she said finally. It kept me warm. He nodded. Fire warms, he said, but it also burns. What does it cost you? She swallowed. No one asks that. I ask now. She looked at the ground. Everything. My joy, my friends, my peace. And has it protected you? Her voice broke. No. But it gave me something to hold. I didn't know what else there was. The Buddha sat down on the earth. No gesture of grandeur, no ritual, just sitting, inviting, not her body but her pain, and something in her tired, raw, and unsure responded. She didn't sit beside him to follow. She sat because her legs suddenly felt too heavy to hold her rage any longer. I thought if I forgave, she said, I would be saying, what happened didn't matter. He looked at her. Forgiveness is not forgetting, he said. It is remembering without bleeding. She closed her eyes. The sun had shifted slightly above. Birds continued their morning songs, unaware or perfectly aware of the quiet transformation happening beneath their wings. For a while, they said nothing, and yet, so much was spoken. After a long silence, Amala turned her face toward him. Why don't you defend yourself? Most men would. He smiled gently. There is no self to defend, only echoes. That answer stopped her breath for a moment. No self, no pride, no wall. She had spent her life building walls out of words, opinions, memories, and loss. And here was someone who had none. How do you live like that? She whispered. Without needing to be right, he looked toward the banyan tree nearby. Its massive roots tangled like the past. When the river meets a rock, he said, it does not argue. It curves. She followed his gaze. You bend, she said. I yield. She considered this. Doesn't that make you weak? No, he said. It makes me unbreakable. A breeze passed through the trees then, carrying the scent of old jasmine and new soil. She sat back slightly, her body softening further. I don't know who I am without the fight, she said. Then, you're close, he replied. The fight was never you. It was only the voice of pain dressed as protection. She stared at her hands. So many years clenched, so many moments missed. Have I wasted my life? She asked. No, he said. You have lived it. And now, you begin again. Tears didn't fall. They gathered. They shimmered, like dew unsure if it should become rain. I don't know how, she said. Start small, he said. Start with breath. One moment where you don't carry the sword. One morning where you just sit. One conversation where you don't prove anything. She nodded, slowly, as if teaching her neck to move without anger. I thought you would try to convert me, she said. I have nothing to convert you to, he replied. Only a door. Whether you walk through it is yours. She looked up. The light had shifted, but something in her felt lighter still. For the first time in decades, she felt like she could stand without needing to push against anything. She looked around at the villagers, still watching, still holding their breath. Why do they trust you? She asked. He smiled again. Perhaps because I do not ask them to. The simplicity of it, the gentleness of it, the power of it. She stood then, not with pride, not with shame, just with peace. I'm tired, she said, but it's a new kind of tired. He bowed his head. Rest, and when you wake, begin. And then, without ceremony, he rose and began to walk. No need for applause, No need for final words. His silence had already said everything. And Amala, once flame, now ember, watched him go. And for the first time in her life, she did not need to be heard. Because finally, she had listened. The road was empty again. The Buddha had passed. The disciples followed. The crowd slowly dissolved as villagers returned to their work, their children, their lives. But for Amala, the moment lingered. She remained seated beneath the same banyan tree where she had first heard him speak all those years ago. But everything was different now. Not outside. Inside. There was no music in the air. No angelic revelation. No voice from the heavens. Only quiet. A different kind of quiet than she had ever known. For most of her life, silence had been a threat, a sign of abandonment, a companion to her loneliest hours. It echoed in the corners of her hut, in the bed sheets where no one slept beside her, in the bowls too clean because no one else had eaten. But now, this silence was not empty. It was spacious. It held her, instead of ignoring her. And that small shift changed everything. She sat for a long time, watching the shadows of the leaves dance across the earth, watching a beetle crawl, watching the breath rise and fall in her own chest. And slowly, memories began to rise, not as weapons, not to stir her pain, but like old stories coming home, asking to be honored and released. She saw herself at 20, laughing beside a river, holding her son before the fever took him. She saw the years after how her heart closed one plank at a time, until nothing could enter. She saw the look in people's eyes when she scolded them. She saw how fear became her language, how control became her mask. And for the first time, she didn't judge any of it. She simply watched, like the Buddha had watched her with eyes that did not demand change, but allowed it. She closed her eyes, and then something extraordinary happened. She began to feel her own body, not just as a tool, not just as a survivor, but as something sacred. Her spine, her breath, her heartbeat, all still here, all still carrying her, after everything, after everyone, still here, alive. Tears rose not of sadness this time, but of wonder. She touched the ground with her hand, rough, warm, solid, like truth. She whispered, not to anyone, not even to herself, just to the moment I'm still here. And the world answered not in words, but in birdsong, in wind through leaves, in the scent of dust and jasmine. She stood, slowly, each movement deliberate, not rushed. For the first time in years, there was no urgency to be anywhere else. She returned to her hut that day differently, not because it had changed, but because she had. The walls were still bare, the bed still narrow, the space still quiet. But now, she entered as someone who didn't need to escape the silence. She sat on the floor and looked around, really looked. The cracks in the clay wall, the threadbare mat, the cup half filled with water, and in it all, beauty. Not decorative beauty, sacred beauty. Unpretentious, unconcerned with being noticed, she made tea, slowly, carefully, each movement a ritual. She didn't realize it, but she was practicing mindfulness, what the Buddha called sati. She had no name for it, only the sensation that for the first time, her life was not rushing ahead without her. The next day, she swept the front of her hut, not because someone might see, but because she finally saw it herself. When a child passed, she smiled, not forced, not performative, but because her face remembered how, that afternoon, she sat beneath the banyan tree again, alone, and for the first time, she didn't bring questions, she brought breath. That night, in her dreams, her son appeared not as a ghost, but as a child again, laughing, holding a flower, and for the first time, she didn't wake weeping. She woke smiling. She whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone, to life itself. This was the beginning of her real transformation, not a moment, not a flash, but a relearning, a remembering, 1,000 small choices. She still had thoughts, still had aches, but something fundamental had shifted. She no longer believed her thoughts without question. She no longer clung to her aches as identity. She watched them now like weather. She noticed how her mind stirred like wind, but she was not the wind. She was the sky, clear, wide, unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, people noticed. Children approached her more easily. Women from the village spoke gently to her again. One brought her fruit. Another sat beside her without words. They didn't ask what had changed. They didn't need to, because some transformations do not require explanation. They speak in silence, in softened shoulders, in slower steps, in eyes that have forgiven themselves. She began, slowly, to share tea with others, sometimes with the woman who had once avoided her gaze, sometimes with a boy whose father had died in a storm. She didn't preach. She just sat and listened. And sometimes, when the moment felt right, she told them, "There's a way to live without needing to fight every shadow." And they would ask how. And she would say, "Start with one breath." Amala's story did not end at the banyan tree. In many ways, it only began there, because something profound happens when a human being chooses to set down anger, not from suppression, but from understanding, not to be passive, but to become truly free. And that story is not just hers. It could be yours. It could be anyone's. In today's world, anger is everywhere. It hides in emails not yet sent, in the silence between loved ones, in traffic, in politics, in quiet resentment that simmers like an untended flame. Sometimes it explodes. Other times, it seeps slowly, staining relationships, souring joy. We carry it like Amala once did, not always knowing its weight, only feeling its familiar heat, because it gives us a kind of power, or so we think. But if we look deeper, we see what Amala saw. That anger, when held too long, no longer protects, it imprisons. So how do we begin to lay it down? How do we walk the same quiet road that Amala walked, where rage gives way to breath, and pain is no longer a prison? We begin where she did, with seeing, to recognize the anger, not as our enemy, but as our messenger, to listen. What is it protecting? What wound does it guard? What fear does it hide? Most of us try to silence anger or justify it, but Amala teaches something different. She didn't defeat her anger. She allowed it to be seen fully, without defense, and in that seeing, it began to soften. Imagine, now, a young man in New York. He works long hours. His boss never acknowledges his effort. One day, his coworker gets promoted instead. He burns, not visibly, but inside. Something tightens. He becomes sharp at home, distant with friends, sarcastic in meetings. Anger takes the wheel, not because he is cruel, but because he's hurting, and he doesn't know how to grieve what he hasn't been allowed to express. Now imagine that instead of tightening, he pauses, he breathes, he notices there is pain in me, and he names it not to wallow, but to honor. And he asks, is this pain mine to carry forever? That moment that breath can change a life. Because in naming it, he is no longer consumed by it, and in breathing with it, he is no longer afraid of it. This is how Amala changed, and this is how we change, not through heroic declarations, but through tiny acts of presence. One breath, one less reaction, one pause before replying. You may think that letting go of anger means weakness, but that is a lie the anger tells you to keep itself alive. In truth, forgiveness is the fiercest act of strength, because it means you refuse to let your life be shaped by someone else's wound. You reclaim your power, not by shouting, but by choosing peace when pain begs you to strike. Imagine a parent who shames you, a partner who betrayed you, a system that overlooked you. You're not asked to forget. You're not asked to approve. You're invited to be free. Because when you let go of the story that binds you, you begin to write a new one. Amala's freedom wasn't dramatic. She didn't preach. She made tea. She smiled more. She watched the sunset like it was her first. This, too, is healing. Gentle, unnoticed, but real. And it ripples. You cannot control how the world treats you, but you can choose what you carry forward. When someone insults you, remember what the Buddha told Amala. You only gave me your suffering, and suffering does not deserve punishment. It deserves space. Space. The breath before the reaction. The silence after the trigger. The moment between pain and reply. In that space lives your freedom. If you find yourself today holding something heavy, a grudge, a betrayal, a guilt, a name that still stings, a face you avoid, ask yourself, what has this anger cost me? What has it protected? And is it still serving me now? Maybe the answer won't come quickly. Maybe it will take years, like Amala. That's okay. Start with breath. Sit in silence, not to force peace, but to meet yourself. Not the angry version, not the hurt version, the whole version beneath it all. It's there, waiting, like the banyan tree, like the Buddha's eyes, like forgiveness. Just outside the door, the wooden floor creaked beneath his knees, but he barely noticed anymore. 15 years. 15 years of bowing, breathing, listening, waiting. 15 years of sunrises over mountain peaks, of wind sweeping through pine trees, of chants echoing across ancient roofs. And through it all, Kyogan sat faithful, disciplined, quiet. He had come to the monastery in his youth, carrying the same fire many seekers bring: the longing for truth, the thirst for something more permanent than praise, more real than success. His heart had been wide open then, trusting, even naive. The robes, the silence, the ritual each felt like a doorway to something sacred. But doorways must open, and for Kyogan, they never had. He sat, and the silence was just silence. He breathed, and it was only breath. He watched his thoughts rise and fall, like waves on the surface of a lake. But beneath the surface, Still. Nothing. Not peace. Not light. Not even clarity. Just questions that returned, like old ghosts. At first, he didn't doubt. He blamed himself. Maybe he wasn't sitting correctly. Maybe his posture needed correction. Maybe his intention wasn't pure enough. So he tried harder. He doubled his hours on the cushion. He fasted through full moons. He cleaned the meditation hall with a toothbrush, but the silence still felt hollow. And slowly, over the years, something subtle but dangerous began to grow inside him. Not rage, not despair, disbelief, not the kind you shout, the kind you whisper to yourself when no one else can hear. What if I'm not meant to wake up? What if this path isn't for me? He kept these thoughts to himself. He knew how to smile with the other monks. He nodded during the master's talks. He repeated the chants with precision, but beneath the surface, his spirit had grown thin like paper stretched too many times in the rain. And then came the shame. Because how do you tell your teacher that after 15 years? You're not sure why you came. How do you confess that every time the bell rings? Your heart sinks instead of rises, that you dread the silence now, that your own mind feels like a stranger you no longer want to meet. So, he said nothing. He bowed. He swept. He walked with the others. But at night, he would lie awake and listen not to the breath, but to the echo of his own emptiness. Some nights, he heard others crying softly in their rooms. He knew he wasn't alone, but no one spoke of it, as if to question the path was to betray it, as if suffering in silence was more virtuous than asking. Is this truly the way Kyogan became quiet, not from stillness, but from fatigue, from disappointment too sacred to voice? He envied even the farmers outside the monastery. They woke, they planted, they harvested, they watched something grow. But in all his years, what had he grown? He opened the sutras each morning, but the words no longer lit anything inside him. He heard his master's teachings, but they passed through him like wind through bamboo. He wondered what was wrong with him, and worse, he feared that nothing was, that maybe this was it. Maybe the truth wasn't radiant. Maybe enlightenment was a myth whispered to keep monks in line. Maybe he'd spent his life chasing an idea. One evening, after the evening bell, he slipped out and sat by the old stone well near the temple wall. It was rarely visited anymore, overgrown with moss, forgotten by most. But Kyogan liked it. It didn't promise anything. It didn't pretend to be more than what it was: deep, dark, silent. He stared into its water. The moon's reflection trembled slightly on the surface. How long must I sit before something changes? He whispered. No one answered. Not the stars, not the trees, not even his own breath. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt. Not because the world was large, but because he was beginning to suspect. He didn't matter to it. And then came a thought. Quiet, uninvited, but undeniable. I want to leave. His chest tightened, his jaw clenched, not because it was wrong, but because it felt true. He wanted to leave. Not the monastery. The path, the seeking, the whole idea of some final answer. He was tired of chasing, tired of pretending he wasn't tired, And that admission broke something open. Not loudly, not like a storm, more like a single drop of water finally slipping from the leaf that had held it too long. He cried, not in sorrow, in relief, because finally he had stopped lying to himself. And in that truth, something unexpected appeared. Stillness, but not the forced kind. A quiet that didn't demand anything from him. Not effort, not reverence, not clarity, just presence. He sat there for hours, not meditating, just being. No goals, no techniques, just breath, and the soft sound of his own heart saying, "You're allowed to not know." That night, he returned to his room and slept more deeply than he had in years, not because he had found the answer, but because he had stopped punishing himself for not finding it. The morning after that long night by the well, Kyogan rose with no plan in his chest. He didn't intend to leave. He didn't intend to stay. He simply moved, like wind through reeds without resistance, without force. That morning, the master was walking alone beneath the camphor trees. He noticed Kyogan from afar, not by his steps, but by his stillness. The boy who once walked with a mission now walked without destination. The master approached. Kyogan bowed, but not with the same urgency as before. No performance, no pleading, just presence. The master gestured for him to follow. They walked in silence down the stone path, past the small koi pond, into the quiet corner of the temple, where the moss grew thickest. The master sat beneath an old pine, the bark worn smooth where robes had brushed it for decades. Kyogan sat beside him, still. The master said nothing. Finally, after what felt like the length of a breath in the stretch of a season, the master asked softly, "You've climbed the pole, haven't you?" Kyogan turned, confused. What pole? The master smiled not at him, but toward the sky, the 100-foot pole. He said, "You've climbed it. You've reached the top, and now you're stuck." Kyogan blinked. "I don't understand." The master's voice was steady, but not heavy, like wind bending a branch without breaking it. "You've done the rituals, sat the hours, memorized the sutras. You've lived the form, the structure, the shape of practice, but the view from the top is empty. Isn't it?" Kyogan didn't speak. He couldn't, because it was true. There was no more pole to climb, but he didn't know how to descend, didn't even know if there was a way down. And then the master asked a question, one Kyogan would carry in his marrow for the rest of his life. When you reach the top of a 100-foot pole, how do you step off? The words landed like thunder wrapped in silk. They didn't accuse, they didn't instruct, they simply opened a space, a silence, a mirror. Kyogan's lips parted, but no answer came. Not because he didn't know, but because the question had never occurred to him. His whole life had been the climb, each rule a rung, each bow a grasp higher, each breath a step toward the summit. But now, at the top, he saw there was no next step, unless he let go, unless he jumped. "But won't I fall?" he finally asked. The master nodded. Yes. Kyogan waited for comfort. None came. But then, what he asked again. The master's gaze turned gentle. Then, he said, "You learn what was never on the pole." Kyogan looked away. He saw the sun pierce through branches. He saw a beetle crawl across his sandal. He saw, for the first time, that perhaps all his effort had been toward the wrong direction, not because it was worthless, but because it was never meant to be the destination, only the preparation. "You're not failing," the master said. "You're arriving." Kyogan's breath shook. "I thought enlightenment was the top of the pole." The master shook his head. "No, that's just where the ego runs out of space." Kyogan smiled, a soft, breaking smile, the kind that comes when the lie you've been living dissolves in your hand and you realize you're still whole. That evening, he returned to his cushion, not to chase, not to earn, but simply to sit. And in that sitting, he took the first step, off the pole. The morning fog curled along the stone path like breath. Kyogan walked alone, a small basket of herbs swinging gently in his hand. The world hadn't changed. The stones were still cold. The truk trees still lined the edge of the garden, bending slightly with the weight of dew. But something inside him had loosened. Since the conversation with the master, everything felt both heavier and lighter. He couldn't explain it. He hadn't reached any conclusions, but the effort to force meaning had fallen away. He walked slowly now, not as a monk trying to impress silence, but as a man who was finally starting to listen to it. He stopped near the temple's sidewall to rest. His hand brushed the rough bark of a truk stalk, and then it happened. A small stone, no bigger than a fruit pit, rolled loose from the garden edge, perhaps dislodged by a bird, perhaps the wind, perhaps nothing at all. It fell, fast, and struck a hollow stalk of truk. The sound that followed was nothing spectacular, just a clear, sharp talk. But something about it tore the sky open inside him. It wasn't just a sound. It was a bell. It was a thunderclap. It was a mirror shattering and showing him his own face beneath all masks. He stopped breathing, not in fear, in wonder, in absolute presence. The talk echoed not in the air, but inside his ribs. Everything went still, and in that stillness, he heard it again, not the sound, but the truth behind it. For 15 years, he had chased silence, discipline, devotion. But this sound, this sharp, unintentional strike cut through all of it, because it was pure, because it wasn't trying to be anything, because it simply happened. No meaning, no ritual, and yet it woke him. Tears welled in his eyes. He sat where he stood, dropping the basket. He didn't move. He just sat, letting the sound vibrate through the hollow places in him. And with every breath, a new layer fell away. The pressure to awaken, the guilt of not awakening, the shame of doubt, the pride of effort. Gone. 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 Only the sound remained. And in that sound, he met himself not as monk, not as seeker, not as failure, not as worthy, just as being, breathing, watching, alive. When the master passed by hours later, he saw Kyogan still seated, eyes open. A single tear dried on his cheek. The master didn't speak. He only smiled. He recognized the silence. It wasn't the quiet of suppression. It was the quiet after a bell has rung inside the soul. Later that evening, Kyogan wrote in his journal, not because he needed to explain, but because the moment had asked to be witnessed. He wrote, It wasn't the teachings that awakened me. It was the truth hiding behind a small stone and a hollow stalk of truk. The world had always been speaking. I had simply been shouting too loudly to hear it. He closed the book, and from that day forward, he still sat, still bowed, still served tea, but no longer for awakening. He did it from awakening, not the kind that ends seeking, the kind that ends the need to become someone else. And in that, he had finally stepped off the pole. The sky was heavy with the promise of rain. Kyogan sat beneath the veranda, his gaze soft, hands resting on his knees. Since his awakening, the world no longer appeared as a puzzle to solve, but a poem to receive. And yet, his life was not free from tension, not his own, but the tension in others. He could feel it in the footsteps of the young monks who passed him, especially one Renji, bright, quick, sharp as a blade forged too early. Renji came to the temple not for peace, but for conquest. His eyes were constantly scanning sutras, gestures, the faces of elder monks as if decoding enlightenment through comparison. He bowed, but his back never relaxed. He sat, but his breath never softened. He was at war with himself, with time, with silence. And he reminded Kyogan of the very same hunger that had bound him for so long. One morning, after a particularly restless session, Renji approached. Kyogan was in the garden, trimming the dead leaves from a lotus plant. Renji bowed deeply. "Master Kyogan," he said, "I have practiced the form, the breath, the koans. I have fasted. I have watched my thoughts. And yet, I feel farther from awakening than ever. Why won't it come?" Kyogan did not look up. He simply plucked a yellowing leaf and let it fall to the water. Renji waited, impatience rising like fire. "Please," he said, voice tighter. "Isn't there something more direct?" Kyogan finally looked at him, his eyes calm as dusk. "You have filled the cup of your mind with effort," he said softly, "but nothing can pour in when the cup is clenched." Renji frowned. "I don't understand." Kyogan stood. "Then come." He led him through the garden, past the koi pond, into the quiet heart of the temple, where a small flame flickered beside a sacred altar. This flame had been kept alive for decades. Passed from one master to the next, it was used to light incense, to mark ceremonies, but now it would carry another purpose. Kyogan stood beside it, gazing into the flame. Then, without a word, he lifted his right hand and placed it slowly into the fire. Renji gasped. "No, master." He rushed forward, but Kyogan did not move. His hand remained open, still, unfazed as the flame licked gently at his skin. Renji froze, not because of the pain he expected to see, but because there was none. There was no flinch, no strain, just stillness. The kind of stillness that didn't belong to endurance but to absence, to the absence of clinging, of self. Kyogan finally withdrew his hand after a few long seconds and wrapped it in cloth. Calm as if nothing had occurred, Renji stood trembling. His mind, once filled with techniques, now collapsed into silence. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you do that?" Kyogan met his eyes. "Because words could not reach where your ideas were hiding." Renji dropped to his knees. His breath came shallow, but his heart cracked open. In that moment, he saw the truth. He had not been practicing to wake up. He had been practicing to improve the one he believed he was. polishing a mask, perfecting a name. But here was Kyogan, showing him that true realization begins only when all masks burn away. Renji's tears came not from sadness, but relief, like a rope that had gripped too tight finally loosening its hold. He bowed fully. Not from duty, but from falling inward into something deeper than pride, something quieter than ambition. Kyogan placed his unburned hand gently on the young man's shoulder. "The fire does not burn what is not held," he said. And with that, the wind shifted, the rain began to fall, and two beings sat no longer master and student, but flame and sky. The rain from the day before had washed everything clean. Leaves glistened, stones darkened. The air carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Kyogan stood in the temple courtyard, barefoot, eyes open but unfocused as if looking without seeking. Renji had returned to his meditation. His breath was quieter now. The fire in him had not vanished, but it had changed direction. It burned inward. Kyogan watched him with a calm heart, but this morning, his thoughts turned not to his student, but to the nature of his own journey. Years ago, he would have tried to explain realization. He would have reached for metaphors, waves, mirrors, candles. He would have spoken of emptiness, form, non-duality. But now, he knew better, because the moment you try to hold the sky in your palm, it slips away. The truth he had found did not live in thought. It shimmered just beyond the reach of words, like a bell that rings inside the chest, not the ears. A knowing that arrives when the knower disappears. He walked slowly toward the old stone well, the same one where, years ago, he had whispered into the moon's reflection, asking why awakening had not come. Now he looked in again, but this time, he didn't ask. He didn't need to. The surface was still. The moon was still. And the one looking was still. That was the difference. Before, he had looked with eyes of seeking. Now, he simply saw. And what he saw was this. There was no secret, no answer waiting on the other side of effort. The truth had always been here, woven into the sound of his footsteps, the chill of morning air, the slow curve of steam rising from a cup. It had never hidden. He had simply never been still enough to meet it. He remembered something the old master had once said, but he only understood now. The intellect is a clever thief. It steals silence and sells it back as knowledge. He smiled. Yes, he had chased understanding for years, but understanding had only built walls made of concepts. It was when those walls fell, when he stopped naming, stopped comparing, stopped expecting, that reality, bare and simple, revealed itself. He could feel it now, even as the breeze passed over his arms. He didn't have to analyze the wind to be touched by it. He didn't need to explain sunlight to feel its warmth. So why had he spent so long trying to explain himself into awakening? The answer was clear now, because it gave the mind something to do, something to control. But truth cannot be controlled, only received, only allowed. He walked slowly toward the temple gate, where a young novice was scrubbing moss from the stones. The boy looked up, bowed. Kyogan bowed in return, not out of role, out of reverence for the boy, for the stone, for the moment. Everything was sacred, because nothing was being filtered anymore. Nothing was being divided into path and not path. The path was simply This. He sat near the entrance, watching travelers pass beyond the monastery walls. Some hurried, some laughed, some looked lost. All of them were walking the same earth. Some knew it. Most didn't. But that didn't matter. Reality held them all, like a sky that does not require you to believe in it before it offers shade. That was the great paradox. The truth did not need you to awaken to be true. It simply waited, like a lover in the next room, patient, whole. He thought of Renji again, how fiercely he had clung to ideas of progress, how hard he had tried to impress emptiness. But emptiness is unimpressed, because it is not a thing. It is the space in which all things arise. Kyogan reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small leaf, dried, curled, fragile. He let it fall, and as it landed softly on the stone, he felt a deep clarity that this, too, was awakening. Not the act, but the seeing. The full presence with what is. No more, no less. He remembered the moment the stone hit the truk, the clarity of that sound, the way it cut through all explanation. And he understood now that this kind of knowing does not arrive in thought. It arrives when thought pauses, not silenced by force, but calmed by love, by trust, by surrender. That is what he had lacked all those years, not intelligence, not discipline, but trust. Trust that the silence would hold him. Trust that he did not need to do. He only needed to be. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, there was no seeker, no teacher, no Kyogan, just breath, just sound, just sky. And for the 1,000th time but the first, truly he smiled, not because he understood, but because he no longer needed to. The palace was glowing. Lanterns swung like floating suns along the curved wooden corridors. Gold leaf panels reflected flickering candlelight. Servants moved swiftly, adjusting cushions, checking incense, pouring warm sake into porcelain cups hand-painted with plum blossoms. Tonight was no ordinary gathering. A feast was being held in honor of Lord Kenjo's promotion, a man famed not only for his military victories, but for his patronage of temples and scholars alike. The guest list was long, illustrious, officials in crimson robes, scholars with scrolls and long beards, merchants with rings on every finger. They arrived in lacquered palanquins, stepping onto the stone path with careful dignity, their sandals barely touching the earth. Inside, the hall was dressed in opulence, silken drapes embroidered with cranes, plates sculpted in jade, dishes so delicate they looked painted, not cooked, each bite a testament to wealth, to refinement, to control over nature itself. Musicians sat near the western alcove, plucking biwas and flutes in soft harmonies. The air smelled of sandalwood and roasted sesame. Laughter floated gently, like ripples over still water, yet beneath the surface, something else pulsed, a quiet current of pride, of competition, of display. Every gesture was deliberate, every compliment calculated. Even generosity was performance. Gifts were exchanged not out of need, but as signals of alliance, of prestige. And amidst all this glittering perfection, a small, silent figure approached the outer gate. He was dressed in black, not silk, cotton, worn and patched. His hair, unlike the polished top knots of the guests, was tied loosely with a faded cord. In his hand, a simple walking stick, smoothed not by carving, but by years of travel. This was Ikkyu, known in whispers as the Mad Monk, loved by peasants, feared by aristocrats, not because he was violent, but because his presence made masks feel heavy. He was not on the guest list, but he was not stopped. No one quite knew how. Perhaps the guards were distracted. Perhaps they simply sensed something they could not name. He entered quietly. No fanfare, no title announced. He removed his straw sandals and stepped lightly onto the tatami floor, where dozens of robed men turned slowly to look. At first, there was silence. Not offense, not welcome, just confusion. Who was this? Was he a poet? A beggar? A prank? EQ bowed slightly, then walked without invitation to the far end of the hall. He sat not on a cushion, on the floor, cross-legged, still. He did not touch the food, did not speak, did not smile. He simply watched. Lord Kenju noticed, whispered something to a servant. The servant bowed, approached EQ cautiously, and asked, "Honorable one, may I bring you something to eat?" EQ looked up, his eyes soft as dusk. "I would like a bowl of water," he said. The servant blinked. "Water. Yes," EQ said. "From the well outside, not from the kitchen." Confused but bound by duty, the servant nodded and left. The room buzzed softly. Who was this monk? Why did he want well water at a feast of rare teas and plum wines? The servant returned, holding a plain ceramic bowl, cool, slightly damp from the walk. He placed it before EQ. The monk bowed in thanks, then lifted the bowl gently to eye level. He looked into it, long, quiet, as if peering into a mountain lake. Then he lowered it, still didn't drink. Instead, he turned to the hall full of guests and asked one question. What kind of host gives wine to the powerful, but forgets the taste of water? Silence, deep, startled, uncomfortable. He placed the bowl down, untouched. Then he smiled, not mockingly, lovingly, and said, "I've drunk deeply from many wells, but never one so full of emptiness." He stood, bowed to the bowl, and left, leaving behind more stillness than his silence ever carried. The scent of roasted duck, honeyed plum, and powdered yuzu still lingered in the air when EQ requested his water. Not tea, not wine, not the ceremonial sake served in cups as thin as dragonfly wings. Just water, but not from the golden ewers on the banquet table. No, from the old stone well outside, the one that servants rarely used now, replaced by copper piping and heated pots. His request was not loud, but it cut through the room like the chime of a single bell in a hall full of cymbals. For a moment, no one moved. The musicians stopped playing mid-note. The poet, who had just begun reciting a verse, faltered. All eyes turned to the servant, now frozen in front of the seated monk. "Water. From the well?" the servant asked again, almost unsure he'd heard correctly. EQ nodded. His voice was calm, but unwavering. "Yes, not poured from silver, not boiled, just water, from the earth." The servant looked toward Lord Kenju for guidance. Kenju's face did not flinch, but his fingers curled ever so slightly around his cup. He nodded. The servant bowed, turned, and exited quickly through the side doors into the night. Whispers rose like wind through dry grass. Why ask for water? Is it symbolic? Is he mocking us? A merchant chuckled nervously. Perhaps he fasts before indulging. A court official muttered. Perhaps he insults us while pretending humility. EQ said nothing. He remained seated, breathing, watching, not in judgment, but as one who had seen this play many times before. Within minutes, the servant returned, his face slightly flushed, his sleeves damp from the effort. In his hands, a plain ceramic bowl, not ornate, just clay, unpainted, unlabeled, and filled with water, clear, cold, unadorned. He set it before EQ with a small bow. EQ lifted it gently. He did not drink, not yet. Instead, he held it in both hands, palms open, and he stared into the water, as if it were a sacred mirror. And perhaps it was, because the room quieted, as if every guest, every official, every silk-robed observer leaned inward, waiting, not sure for what. EQ spoke, only 4 words, but they echoed like thunder rolling softly over a still valley. This is true offering. He did not explain. He did not elaborate. Instead, he raised the bowl to his lips and drank, slowly, deeply, fully. And when he finished, he set the bowl down as if it were made of moonlight. He bowed to it, then turned his gaze to the room. "Who gave me this?" he asked. The servant stepped forward, nervous. "I did, honorable one." EQ smiled. "No," he said. "You carried it, but the earth gave it, the well gave it, the sky gave it, and you remembered." The servant blinked, unsure whether to feel praised or puzzled. EQ continued, "There is no wealth in a cup of wine poured out of performance. There is no generosity in offering what costs nothing of your being." He turned to the host. "Lord Kenju, true giving does not begin with what is displayed. It begins with what is remembered." The room was utterly still. No one touched their food. No one sipped. The sound of a single drop of water might have split the silence. Then EQ stood. He bowed not low, but with deep stillness. "To give is not to impress," he said. "To give is to return something that never belonged to you in the first place." He began to walk toward the door, and as he passed the servant who had fetched the water, he whispered, "You gave more than all the jewels in this room. You gave what you believed was too simple to matter." He stepped into the night. The door slid closed behind him, and in that silence, the feast felt different, no less delicious, but more exposed, as if someone had drawn aside a curtain and shown them not a truth they didn't know, but one they had forgotten. Night had fallen completely. The feast continued, but something had shifted. Conversations were quieter. Laughter was softer, as if the presence of the monk had lowered the volume of pride in every chest. Lord Kenju remained seated, but his fingers had stilled. He had not touched his wine since EQ left. Outside, the moon had risen clear, round, undisturbed. Its light draped over the temple roofs like a silk scarf, casting long shadows and silver outlines along the garden stones. The servant who had brought EQ, the water, stood now at the edge of the courtyard, his eyes drawn toward the well. He couldn't explain why, but something in him felt unfinished. He walked slowly toward it, not rushed, not hesitant, just drawn like leaves drawn to the flow of a gentle stream. The well was quiet, its rim cold to the touch. He looked in, and there, framed by stone and sky, was the moon, perfect, whole, unmoving, reflected. The servant gasped, not from surprise, but from recognition. It was the same water he had drawn for the monk. But now, it was not just water. It was a mirror, and what it showed was everything he had forgotten. He remembered his childhood when he would fetch water for his mother, how she would pause every time to look into the bucket before drinking. She used to whisper, "Look, the sky came with it." He'd forgotten that. Years of running, bowing, serving, surviving. He had forgotten that water could carry the heavens. And now, here it was again, the moon. So close, so untouchable. He reached toward it, instinctively. And, of course, the reflection rippled, gone. Then slowly, as the water settled, returned. He sat by the well for a long time, not thinking, just breathing, just remembering. And far behind him, inside the great hall, Lord Kenju rose. He did not announce himself. He did not call for music or raise his cup. Instead, he walked quietly out into the courtyard, his long robe brushing the floor behind him like a question. He found the servant sitting by the well and joined him. The two men did not speak for a while, just watched the moon together. Then Kenju asked, "Did he drink it?" The servant nodded. Yes, slowly, like it mattered. Kenju stared into the water. "I don't know what he came to show us." The servant's voice was barely above a whisper. "He didn't come to show. He came to remind. Remind us of what." The servant paused, then answered, "That the moon isn't ours. We can offer the bowl, but the light is not something we own." Kenju looked at him. Really looked. And in that moment, rank disappeared. Role disappeared. Only two men, watching a reflection that neither could touch, and yet it touched both of them. The next morning, when the servants cleared the remains of the feast, they found something strange on the center table. The finest cup, empty, and beside it, a simple bowl of water, untouched, but glowing softly, with moonlight. The moon had climbed high. It cast a pale light over the tiled roofs of the great hall, softening every hard edge, making even the sharpest corners seem gentle, distant, reflective. The courtyard lay in silence, scattered with the after-scent of cooked sesame oil and the echoes of a celebration that no longer seemed so celebratory. After Ikkyu's quiet departure, the room inside had not returned to its former state. Something about that bowl of water so plain, so ordinary, had changed how everyone saw the gold and jade and silk. But it wasn't inside the hall that the most profound shift occurred. It was by the old well, the very one that the servant had rushed to earlier. Slightly irritated, not fully understanding the importance of what he had been asked to fetch. Now, he found himself drawn back to it, not out of duty, not even out of curiosity, but because something inside him wanted to see. He stood before the stone ring of the well. Cool Dadatu? Touch. He leaned over, and there it was, the moon, not in the sky, in the water, still, whole, unmoving, held perfectly in the reflection, as if the well had caught the heavens and laid them into his hands. He blinked. He knew it wasn't real. He knew that the moon hadn't truly come down into the water. But his body didn't feel that way. His breath slowed. His shoulders, so often clenched, softened. He sat, let his legs fold beneath him, watched. And as he watched, he remembered something, a moment from his childhood, long buried. He had been small, maybe 5. His grandmother had taken him to draw water from a well near the village edge. It was an old place, with vines and stones worn smooth by generations of hands. She had drawn a full bucket, placed it on the ground, and motioned for him to come look. He remembered kneeling, remembered peering in, and seeing, just like now, the moon. And he remembered her words, soft as leaves. When you give someone water, remember, you're offering the sky too. He hadn't understood then. It had sounded poetic, strange. Now it rang in his chest like truth when he brought Ikkyu that bowl of water. He had not thought twice. He had rushed, felt inconvenienced, wanted to get back before missing any of the celebration. But now he realized he had carried the sky in his hands and hadn't known it. He looked again at the reflection, tried to touch it. Of course, it broke shimmering into ripples. He pulled back, waited. The water settled. The moon returned, untouched, unmoved. He smiled. That was it. The truth didn't vanish. It only rippled when grasped, but left alone. It revealed itself. He sat there longer than he meant to, just watching, just breathing, just being. And he wasn't alone for long. Footsteps approached, not hurried, measured. Lord Kenju appeared beside the well. The servant looked up, bowed slightly. My lord. Kenju didn't respond immediately. He too looked into the water, saw what the servant saw, a moon, clear as silence. Kenju finally spoke. He made all of this seem so small. The servant hesitated. Kenju smiled, but not with joy, with recognition. Ikkyu. The servant nodded. They both sat. 2 men from different worlds, one rich, powerful, draped in brocade, one simple, calloused, unknown. But before the moon, there was no rank, only reflection. Kenju asked, "Why do you think he asked for water?" The servant thought, then said, "Because it was real." Kenju tilted his head. "What do you mean?" The servant stared into the well. He didn't want what was prepared to impress. He wanted what we had forgotten, what nourishes, what doesn't try to be anything more than it is. Kenju said nothing, but he reached out, scooped a small bowl full of water, held it in both hands, and stared into it. The moon shimmered within, and for a moment, his eyes filled with something soft, not tears, something deeper, realization that all his giving, his donations, his festivals, his feasts had not come from presents. They had come from pride. And now, here was a bowl of water that gave more than his gold ever had. He placed the bowl back down and whispered, "I have never truly given anything." The servant did not correct him. He simply said, "Maybe tonight is a beginning." They sat in silence. The moon moved slightly in the sky, but in the water, it remained still, a reflection, a teaching, a gift. And as the night deepened, neither man felt the need to leave, because something had already arrived. The scent of lantern smoke still lingered in the night air as Lord Kenju stood beside the well, his fingers loosely clasped behind his back. The echo of EQ's presence had not faded. It lingered, as quietly powerful as the moonlight brushing the courtyard stones. And as he stood there, no longer the center of celebration, but simply a man beside still water, one thought returned. Again and again, what have I really given? He had been praised his whole life for generosity. Portraits had been painted of him handing alms. Poets had composed verses about his kindness. Monks had chanted blessings for his support of temples. But now, for the first time, he found himself doubting the root of all those offerings. Was it compassion or calculation? He'd given so much land, food, money, ornaments, but had he ever truly let go? He remembered the merchant he once helped after a fire destroyed his store. He'd gifted the man new capital, offered space to rebuild. But months later, when the merchant failed to attend his gathering, Kenju had felt offended, wounded, not because he missed the man, but because he hadn't been thanked publicly. Now, that memory made him ache. He turned to the servant still standing nearby, the one who had fetched the water for EQ. "You," Kenju said gently. "You served him without question." The servant looked uneasy. It was what he asked. "My lord, but not what you expected." Kenju replied, "No." The servant admitted, "But when I gave it, something felt different." Kenju nodded, and he asked nothing in return. Not your name, not your allegiance. They stood in silence. Then Kenju asked, "Do you know what it's like to give and wait to be seen?" The servant hesitated, then said, "I think most people do." Kenju turned back to the well. The moon's reflection wavered slightly in the breeze, then returned to stillness. It did not ask to be seen. It simply appeared when the surface was calm. He recalled the countless ceremonies where he had stood before crowds, handing out silk and rice, pausing just long enough for applause, and he remembered what EQ had done. He had asked for a bowl of water, had bowed to it, and left. No inscription, no banner, no name. That was real giving, not wrapped in display, not traded for admiration, just the act itself pure, direct, silent. "I thought generosity was about quantity," Kenju whispered. "But maybe it's about absence, the absence of self in the act." The servant listened. No correction, no judgment. Kenju continued, "Even this feast was it for celebration, or for my legacy." He remembered the calligrapher he had hired to inscribe his name on scrolls, the stonemason who carved it into the base of the temple statue, the endless repetition of self, masked as virtue. He exhaled, long. The sound of it seemed to draw something out of him. "I want to understand," he said, "how to give like the moon." The servant looked up. Without asking to be noticed, Kenju nodded. The servant said, "Then maybe you start where the moon begins by being still." The words were simple, but they echoed. Because, for the first time, Lord Kenju realized he had always been doing, always arranging, offering, presenting. He had never simply been with what he gave. He sat down beside the well. The stone was cold. He didn't mind. He watched the moon again. And this time, he didn't try to read it, didn't try to name what it meant. He just saw it, bright, silent, enough. He spoke, not to the servant, but to the air. EQ gave nothing, but he left more than all my gifts combined. The servant nodded. Kenju added, "I've realized true giving doesn't leave a trail." "No signature?" The servant said, "No echo." Kenju continued, and no weight of gratitude dragging behind it. He stood, looked toward the temple, then back to the well, then at his own hands. "Tomorrow," he said, "the servants will wake to find every jewel I plan to offer to the court gone." The servant looked up. "Gone where?" My Lord Kenjo smiled. "To the people who need them." Quietly, without notice, without record. "I'll not carve my name in their doorways. I'll not wait for them to bow." The servant's chest swelled, not with pride, with something quieter, witnessing. And Lord Kenju, once seen as the man who gave most publicly, would become someone else entirely. Someone who learned to give without the need to be known. Someone who, like the moon in the water, touched many but asked for nothing. And when, years later, travelers spoke of villages mysteriously rebuilt, temples mended, orphaned children fed by unseen hands, no one thought of Kenju. He had given and let the gift disappear. That was how he began to know peace. The morning sun rose over Lord Kenju's estate, casting golden light through shoji screens and brushing over the stillness left by the night before. The house was quiet, no bustling servants, no ceremonial drums, just the faint sound of wind stirring bamboo outside, and the memory of a bowl of water that had revealed so much. Kenju sat alone, gazing at the ledger in his lap. It was filled with records of his planned offerings, silk to noble houses, gold for temple restorations, lavish goods for political allies. Every line was meticulous, every gift measured, and yet, it all felt heavy now. He stood, walked to the fire, and without ceremony, fed the ledger to the flames. Pages curled and blackened, turning plans into smoke. By mid-morning, he summoned only a handful of trusted aides. To them, he gave quiet instructions, crates of rice to be delivered anonymously to the famine-struck provinces, temple repairs to be funded through unmarked donations, cloth and medicine to reach orphanages without explanation. He forbade them to mention his name. No seals, no banners. Just help. Nothing more. He said, it was the beginning of a new chapter. The man once known for grand gestures now became a silent benefactor. He stopped attending public festivals. He declined tributes. When guests asked why he no longer hosted seasonal banquets, he simply replied, "There is enough food already. Let others eat." His estate, once filled with artworks and ceremonial robes, grew simpler. Hallways emptied, decorations vanished. In their place, quiet, space, and clarity. Each morning, he visited the old well, not for ritual, for remembrance. There, beneath the still surface, the moon had once looked back at him, and in that reflection, he had glimpsed himself, not the Lord, not the name, but the person beneath. Giving had changed for him. No longer was it a path to legacy. Now it was breath, quiet, constant, invisible. One evening, a child arrived at his gate. No shoes, ragged clothing, eyes filled with more years than he'd lived. Kenju took him in, not to adopt, not to display charity, but simply to feed him. The child never learned who Kenju was. He knew only that there was rice, warmth, and silence that did not judge. Years later, that child became a healer. When asked what inspired him, he would say, Someone once gave me everything and asked for nothing. He never mentioned a name. Elsewhere, a temple long left in ruin was restored. Monks arrived to find tools waiting, wood pre-cut, even nails wrapped in cloth. A scroll pinned to the altar simply read, "Give thanks to the stillness." Villagers began to notice quiet kindnesses, new sandals left at the edge of shrines, coins hidden inside prayer boxes, empty bowls filled overnight. No one ever saw who did it. They began calling it the invisible hand, and though none knew, many lives were softened, steadied, and saved. Kenju, now older, walked among them, unrecognized. One winter evening, seated at the edge of a bridge, he overheard two farmers speaking. They say some nobleman is behind all this. One said, "If he is, then he knows what it means to give," said the other. Kenju smiled, not with pride, with stillness. He didn't need to be known, because in letting go of the need for return, he had returned to something truer. Years passed. One spring, his body grew weak. He knew the time had come. No attendants wept, no chants were sung, only the rustle of wind through open doors. He lay by the well, and in its water. Again, the moon, he whispered, to give without shadow, to love without claim. This is enough. He closed his eyes and disappeared, but what he left did not. In every corner, where hunger met bread, where cold met cloth, where fear met silence, his presence lingered, not as a statue, not as a name, but as a pause, a fullness, a gift that had no giver and needed none. And even after his passing, the quiet movement of his compassion carried on, like a tide that needs no map to find the shore. A single bowl of water had turned his world, and with it, countless others. He had walked away from applause, stepped beyond the shadow of recognition, and found in stillness what legacy never could offer. In the years that followed, stories of the unnamed giver passed from lips to lips. Not all were true. Many were embellished. But what remained constant in every telling was this, that somewhere, a man had once given with no trace, and in doing so, restored dignity where it had withered, lit fires where hearts had gone cold. And if, on quiet nights, someone happened to glance into a bowl of still water and see the moon reflected there, they too might feel what Kenju had felt, that to give with no need to hold, no thirst for return, is to truly see, is to truly be. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that lives between tree trunks and hides under fallen leaves. Chiono walked barefoot along the stone path that led to the small temple hidden in the misty mountain. Her feet were calloused, her robe threadbare, her hands clutching a bamboo bucket filled with water drawn from the stream below. She had climbed that path every morning for the past 20 years. 20 years of sweeping temple floors, washing monks' robes, preparing bowls of rice for those who would meditate all day while she carried wood and fetched water. She wasn't angry, nor impatient, but she longed, not for luxury, not for praise. She longed for awakening. Many monks came and went. Some stayed for a season, others for years. A few, they said, had attained something. They used words like kensho, satori, seeing one's true nature. She heard those words while preparing tea, never daring to ask more. Until one evening, after a long rain, she went to the head monk. She bowed deeply and asked, "Master, I have served this temple for 2 decades. I have never missed a morning. I have never questioned a chore. But I wonder, is this path I walk also a path to awakening? The master looked at her, quiet, still, then nodded. He said only this: carry your water, be with it. She didn't understand, but she obeyed. The next morning, the bucket felt heavier, not with water, but with meaning. Each step on the path felt slower, more deliberate. She watched the way the bamboo handle bent under weight. She noticed how the droplets clung to the rim, how they shimmered in the sun. Day after day, she carried water, not as a task, as a question. Years passed. The mountain grew colder, her body slower, but the longing didn't fade. She began to notice things she had never seen before. The way moss crept up the sides of the stone path, the way wind bent the trees, like monks bowing in motion. She began to see her own breath in the morning air, rising and vanishing. Each breath became part of her practice. Each drop of water, a mirror. Sometimes she cried while climbing, not from pain, from the mystery of it all, that something as simple as carrying water could feel like holding the sky. Then one morning, just before dawn, something shifted. She was climbing, as always, the path slippery with dew. The bucket was full, swaying gently. A bird called out, sharp and sudden. She turned her head. Her foot slipped. The bucket fell. It hit a rock and broke. Water spilled across the path, racing downhill in wild little streams. She froze, stared. The bamboo lay shattered, the water gone. Something inside her broke, too. But it wasn't sorrow. It wasn't regret. It was silence, stillness, a clear, wordless realization. There was never anything to carry. No bucket, no water, no self. Only this moment, only this breath. The years of labor, the longing, the questions all fell away like the shattered bucket. And she laughed, softly at first, then deeply. Tears in her eyes, knees in the wet earth. She laughed like someone remembering a joke they had forgotten was their own. She walked back to the temple, empty-handed, but her heart was full. When the head monk saw her, he smiled. "You dropped it," he said. She bowed. "I did." "Finally," he said. From that day on, Chiono no longer walked the path as a servant. She walked it as silence, walking silence. She continued to sweep floors, prepare tea, and carry wood, but her movements were different, slower, clearer, infused with the stillness that had awakened in her. She began teaching, not with words, but with her presence. Younger monks would watch her and feel their own hearts quiet. One day, a student asked, "What changed you?" She handed him an empty bowl. He looked confused. She smiled and said, "What you seek cannot be held, only seen when you let go." The story of Chiono and her broken bucket spread across regions, but she remained untouched by fame. She continued to rise before dawn, breathe with the trees, and serve tea to the present moment. Years later, when she passed away, the temple did not build a monument. They planted a single bamboo by the stream. Each spring, it bent gently in the breeze, and those who passed by said they could still hear her laughter, drifting through the forest, light and free, a laughter born not of gaining anything, but of letting go, of seeing, finally, that there was never anything missing, that the journey was not toward something new, but toward the place where everything unnecessary falls away. And there, in that clearing, in that emptiness, the truth stands quietly, waiting to be seen. The sun barely crept over the mountains, casting a soft amber glow across the monastery. Birds stirred in the trees, and the dew still held fast to the petals of wildflowers. Amid the hush of early morning, an old man moved slowly across the garden. He was bent with age, his robes faded, his hands gnarled like the roots of the pines he tended. Every morning, without fail, he rose before dawn and walked the narrow path from his small quarters to the garden that circled the temple grounds. This man was once a revered Zen master, a teacher to many. His teachings had drawn seekers from far and wide. His voice had carried in halls now silent. But now, no one called him master. They called him simply the gardener. He never corrected them. To the young monks, he was just the old man who pulled weeds and watered trees. Some bowed respectfully, others barely noticed. But each day, he worked the earth with the same care and clarity he once offered in Dharma talks. No sermon, no scroll, no koan could match the patience with which he pruned the dead branches of a plum tree, or the precision with which he placed a stone at the base of a path. One day, a young novice, new to the monastery, watched from the temple steps. The old man, now past 80, was hauling a bucket of compost, sweat dripping from his brow. The novice approached, hesitant. "Master," he said, "why do you still do this work? Shouldn't the younger ones care for the garden now?" The old man set down the bucket and looked up, smiling gently. "If I do not care for the garden, who will care for me?" The novice frowned. "But you have no need for food or comfort. You've seen the truth. You've taught for decades. Surely there is nothing left to prove." The old man chuckled. "Then you do not understand. This is not proving. This is being." He dipped his fingers into the soil, let it crumble through them. "Before I knew anything," he said, "I chopped wood and carried water. Then I studied sutras, sat through winters of silence, crossed oceans of doubt. I argued with philosophers, led disciples, built temples. Now," he picked up a rake, its handle worn smooth. "Now I chop wood and carry water and rake leaves, just as before. But now, I know what I am doing." The novice blinked. "And what is that?" The old man looked up at the sky. "I am doing nothing at all." For a moment, the novice said nothing, then asked, "But if it's nothing, why do you do it?" The master leaned on his rake. "Because it is what arises." He turned back to the garden. The novice watched as the old man continued raking, each motion deliberate and free. In time, he returned each morning to watch, then to help, then to learn. Years later, when people spoke of the great Zen master, they rarely mentioned his writings. They spoke of how he raked, how he smiled at trees, how, in the final years of his life, he taught not through words, but through the stillness of tending a garden. And when he passed, they did not build a statue. They simply let the garden grow, wild in places, orderly in others, as he had left it, as it was. In that very same garden, after the master's passing, a bench was added not in tribute, but for those who wished to sit and breathe with the morning, Monks old and young took turns tending to the plants, not because they were told to, but because something in them leaned toward it. The trees he once pruned now grew tall and bowed, forming shaded arches above paths worn by quiet feet. Pebbles still lined the edges, each one placed by his weathered hands, and under the plum tree. A single stone bore no name, only an inscription. Chop wood, carry water. Visitors who came seeking profound truths were sometimes puzzled. They expected relics, grand symbols, sacred texts. Instead, they found broomsticks leaning gently against the garden wall, buckets by the well, and silence that seemed to hum with presence. The novice who once questioned him eventually became a teacher himself, but he kept no titles, wrote no doctrines. When asked about the master's final lesson, he would point toward the earth and say, "He showed me that truth is not hidden in clouds or books, but revealed in the dirt under your nails." And in his final years, that novice, now old, was seen each morning walking the same garden path, pulling weeds, pouring water, touching leaves, not as duty, but as prayer, each morning. As the fog lifted from the hills surrounding the temple, a strange chant echoed through the stone corridors and drifted through the monastery gardens. Master Zuigen, and then, "Yes. Are you awake? Yes, I am. Don't be deceived by others. No, I will not." Young monks whispered about it behind closed doors. Visitors raised eyebrows. Some thought the old master had gone senile, but Zuigan's gaze clear as the mountain air betrayed no confusion. There was something undeniably present in his voice, like a bell rung in stillness. He had been a master for decades, renowned not only for his insight, but for his eccentric methods. Yet now, in his older years, he had taken to this odd ritual every morning, without fail. Some days, he would laugh after the last line. Other days, he would fall silent, eyes moist, but always, he would bow gently to the space before him as if addressing an invisible companion. One afternoon, a bold student approached him. "Master," he asked, "why do you call out to yourself every morning?" Zuigan looked at him for a long moment, then motioned for the student to sit. "Do you hear the birds?" he asked. "Yes." "Do they ask permission to sing?" "No." "Then why do you ask why I speak?" The student blinked, unsure if he had erred. Zuigan continued, "All my life I sought a teacher. I found many. Some taught me scriptures, others silence, but the hardest one to face," he paused, pointing to his own chest, "was the one in here." He rose slowly, walked to a nearby mirror, and pointed at his reflection. "This one, the one I carried everywhere, that was the hardest to awaken." The student remained silent, sensing something deeper unfolding. Zuigan walked outside, the student following. They moved past the temple gate to a stone basin filled with water. The surface shimmered with the sky. Zuigan bent down, tapped the water gently. "Who is this?" The student leaned over. His own face stared back. It's me," he said. Zuigan smiled. "That's where I began," he said. "But that me, is it constant? Is it fixed, or is it like this water?" The student watched the ripples fade, always changing. He whispered. Zuigan nodded. "Exactly. And yet, we spend our lives building walls to protect that which shifts like mist." He looked up. "So I called to myself not to affirm an ego, but to awaken the watcher, the one who sees even the name Zuigan come and go." They walked in silence for a while. The garden, vibrant with spring, rustled softly. Sometimes, Soyen said, we must speak aloud the truth we've hidden from ourselves, not for others to hear, but so we cannot run from it. The student asked, do you always answer truthfully? Soyen chuckled. No, but I try again the next morning. That night, the student lay awake, listening. In the still dark, the familiar chant rose once more. Master Soyen. Yes. Are you awake? Yes, I am. Don't be deceived by others. No, I will not. And in that rhythm, something stirred within him, not as a lesson, but as a calling. Years later, when Soyen had long passed, the student, now a teacher himself, continued the ritual, not to mimic, but to remember. To remember the voice beneath voices, the watcher within. And when asked by his students what it meant, he would answer simply, when the self learns to listen to itself, truth is not far behind. Thus, through one man's strange morning ritual, 1,000 others learned to speak to the part of themselves they had long forgotten until it answered back, clear and free. In the years following Soyen's passing, that call became a quiet tradition. New monks were encouraged not to imitate it externally, but to find their own internal conversation. Not everyone spoke aloud. Some wrote questions in sand, others whispered to the wind, and some sat silently until the answer emerged from stillness. A story grew among the students that Soyen had once gone into the forest for 3 days and spoke to no one except himself. When he returned, he said only, I finally heard me. In time. His call became not a formula, but a doorway, an entry into intimacy with the self, a way to meet not the self-image, but the raw, breathing presence beneath it. One of his disciples once said, before I heard his morning call, I thought awakening was about silence. After I heard it, I knew it was about listening. Years passed. Students came and went, but each one, in their own way, found that moment when they had to ask themselves, am I awake? And some found the courage to answer, yes, I am. And still, the voice continues, not in the corridors, not in the chants, but in the quiet spaces between thoughts, where the watcher waits, where truth listens. It was an unusually hot afternoon, the kind of heat that presses down on your shoulders like a heavy thought. Duan, a young monk known for his sharp intellect and sharp tongue, was pacing beneath the Bodhi tree. His sandals scuffed the earth in tight, restless circles. Nearby sat Yamoka, an elder in the Sangha, reclining quietly against a stone, eyes half closed, his breathing slow, even, undisturbed by the heat or Duan's circling energy. Duan finally stopped and turned sharply toward Yamoka. Why do you just sit there? Doesn't the heat bother you? Yamoka didn't open his eyes. I let the heat pass through. Duan scoffed. Poetic nonsense. You mean to say it doesn't affect you? Now Yamoka opened his eyes. Slowly, it affects the body, but I don't add a second fire with my mind. Duan folded his arms. Easy to say when you're not the one being insulted daily by the others. They don't respect me. They say I'm arrogant, that I talk too much, that I think too much. Yamoka nodded gently. And to you, Duan's eyes flared. Does it matter? Their opinions are like flies. I swat one. Another appears. Silence. Then Yamoka asked, are you angry now? Of course I am. Duan snapped. Where is this anger? What do you mean, can you show it to me? Place it in my hands. Duan frowned, puzzled. Of course not. It's in me, in my chest, in my mind. Then what if we removed your name, your title, your memory? Would there still be anger? Duan stared. That's absurd. Those things make me who I am. Yamoka smiled faintly. And yet, none of those things can be held. They're thoughts, names, shadows. He leaned forward. If there is no fixed self, no solid you, then tell me. Dear Duan, who is angry? Duan opened his mouth, then closed it. He sat slowly beside Yamoka, the heat pressing in, but no longer unbearable. Then, if there is no one to be angry, what is this heat inside me? Energy, Yamoka replied. A flame. But flames burn only when fed. Stop feeding the story, and the fire fades. They sat in silence. A breeze moved gently through the trees. Duan finally asked, Why do you never argue? Because arguing strengthens the I that wants to win. I watch that I rise, and I let it go. Isn't that denial? No, it's liberation. That night. Duan did not speak at the communal meal. He sat quietly, watching the way rice steamed in the bowl, the way others laughed and bickered and passed dishes. He felt a small tightness in his chest. He watched it, breathed, did not name it. The next morning, he returned to Yamoka. I watched it, he said. The flame, it still came, but I didn't fuel it. Yamoka nodded, Duan added, and I saw something strange. I saw that I was watching it, that the part of me observing wasn't the anger. That, Yamoka said, is the beginning of the path, Duan asked. And the end, Yamoka smiled. When even the watcher dissolves. They sat together as the sun rose, later that year. A visitor asked Duan, now calmer, if he remembered the moment he changed. He pointed to the stone under the Bodhi tree. I once sat here, trying to prove I was right, that I existed, that I mattered. But an old monk asked me, if there is no self, who is angry? And I didn't know, the visitor asked. And now Duan replied, now, I still don't know, but I'm not angry about it. And he smiled. Sometimes, it is not answers that free us, but the undoing of questions. And in that undoing, we find peace. The monastery garden was quiet again. The wind that once carried debates, frustrations, and aspirations now whispered softly between bamboo stalks. A stillness had begun to root itself in the hearts of those who had walked the path, not the path of stones and steps, but of their own inner landscape. As the students gathered in the meditation hall for the annual reflection, Master Yoru rose. He was neither the oldest nor the most eloquent monk, but he had listened deeply, and now he was asked to speak. He stepped forward, palms pressed together, and bowed. Then, with a voice soft but resonant, he began. We often come to the temple looking for answers, he said, but we leave with questions that dissolve the need for answers. He looked around. Eyes met his, expectant, curious. Let me tell you of those who helped open these gates of not knowing. He spoke first of Chiono, who carried water not to awaken, but because that was what the morning asked of her. She had not found truth in books, but in the silence after the bucket broke, in the empty hands that once held desire. Then he spoke of the gardener master, who taught, not through speech, but through the slow raking of leaves, who showed that enlightenment need not be declared, but lived in each stroke, each weed, each pause. Next, he mentioned Zuigan, who called his own name not out of madness, but from a deeper sanity, who answered himself, not to impress others, but to remind his soul not to forget itself in the roles it played, and Yamoka, the quiet rock, who undid Dwan's anger not by challenging it, but by asking who, truly, is angry when there is no fixed self. These, Master Yoru said, are not just tales, they are mirrors. He paused, allowing the room to settle. And if you listen carefully, each story holds a contradiction, a paradox, something the logical mind cannot resolve. But the heart softens before it, opens. He turned toward the open doorway, where the garden waited. We are told to find the truth. We must seek, yet truth is found when seeking ends. We are told to awaken. We must learn. Yet awakening often comes when knowledge is released. We are told to be free. We must act. Yet the freest moments come when we are still. He looked back to the students. These are not mistakes. They are koans, seeds of awakening planted not in the mind, but in the marrow. Master Yoru sat. No one applauded. No one spoke. And yet, the silence that followed said everything. Later that evening, under a moonlit sky, a young novice named Reiko walked alone in the garden, her feet silent on the moss-covered stones. Her thoughts turned like windmills in slow motion. She remembered Chiono's broken bucket, Zuigan's morning ritual, Yamoka's mirror of no self. And she wondered not with tension, but with tenderness who she would be if all her names fell away. She stopped beside the old plum tree, now heavy with fruit. She reached out to touch a leaf, felt the pulse of life in its green veins, and whispered, not to anyone in particular, if I let go of everything, would I finally feel held? The leaf didn't answer, but the breeze that brushed her cheek seemed to say, yes. And in that moment, she smiled, not because she understood, but because she no longer needed to. The next morning, the bell rang as usual, but in every corner of the temple, something had shifted. Not the walls, not the rules, but the way eyes met, the way breaths were taken, the way footsteps touched earth. From paradox, peace had blossomed, and in the heart of not knowing, something clear had awakened, a presence, a stillness, a pathless path, and it welcomed all. As we bring this journey to a close, let us not seek to trap these teachings in words, but allow them to ripple softly through our lives like wind across still water. For what we've walked through together, these stories, these paradoxes, these subtle awakenings were never about answers to hold, but about loosening the grip on what we thought we knew in a world that urges us to speak louder, move faster, prove more. These voices have whispered another way, a way of being instead of doing, of noticing instead of naming, of softening rather than grasping. The broken bucket taught us that the moment it shatters is also the moment something deeper pours through. The gardener monk reminded us that every step, every task, is a form of meditation when done with presence. Zuigan's strange call revealed how the self can become both seeker and witness. And Yamoka's gentle inquiry exposed the illusion of the I that clings to anger, fear, and praise. These are not just old tales from distant temples. They are living truths waiting to unfold within boardrooms and bedrooms, beneath city lights, and in quiet walks after rain. Each of us carries a garden within, a place where thought can rest, where silence blooms. So pause. Before you react, before you speak, before you judge, feel the breath in your chest, the way light falls on a windowsill, the quiet between your thoughts. This is the gate. This is the ground of return. And as you walk back into the rhythms of your day, may you do so a little slower, a little softer, a little more willing to not know. Thank you for walking this path with me. If you found even a sliver of stillness here, let it ripple outward. Share it not to impress, but to uplift, like a candle lighting another, without ever losing its own flame. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you feel moved. And join us next time, where we'll explore another doorway into peace, presence, and the deeper truth that waits quietly in the heart of each moment. Until then, may you be well, may you be free, may you return again and again to this simple now.